Yeah, sure.
Body. Okay. Ruben, you think that's all right? Gary's arrived. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome team. And Vita.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming. And it's going to be looking, of course, at the whole idea of the mutual convergent development process for focusing on the Dnipro, Dniester, Dnieper River, as it were, if one trying all the different ways in which the different language groups pronounce it. And, or not very well, I'm afraid, on my part, but it does have a variety of different enunciations. So very, very glad to have Vitsa joining us today. And Vitsa, you're expert on riverine cooperation. Do you want to say something about yourself?
Well, maybe a bit more, yeah. And also would like to hear a bit about Ruben and Pearson, because I
Yeah.
actually we did talk, but I didn't hear much about others joining us. So
Yeah.
it would be nice to hear a bit, a
Well, why
little bit
not do
back.
that as well?
But
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
from my side, I've been involved basically in cross-border cooperation since well, quite early on in my career. I started off with working at a big engineering company, landscape renovation, focusing on my background is in rather geography-like, you could say. I've been studying land and water management, as it is called now, at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And from there, I was going to a big engineering company, which is now part of a Swedish conglomerate called Sweco. They do a lot about land and water management, basically, and those kind of planning of large infrastructure, also housing and planning, also these kind of projects. From there, I started the main part of my career in cross-border cooperation. I worked for 12 years on the Dutch-German border, developing cross-border projects and programs, and including already at that time water management as well as other issues.
So, Vitsa,
Um,
can you give the dates that you're doing that, please?
well, I finished my studies in 1984. I
Mm-hmm.
started working. It's cross-border agency 1989
Mm-hmm.
until 2001. So I've
Okay.
worked there for 12 years.
Yeah, yeah.
And actually, there's a EU program called Interreg, Interregional Cooperation. And this EU program actually started in the border regions, and we were one of the pioneering regions where it was carried out the first time in the early 90s. So that was really the kickoff of my career in cross-border and EU funding based projects. And from there, gradually, I turned into becoming self-employed, which I am basically since 2005, you can say, or even earlier, working on all kind of freelance projects in the meantime, and basically still continuing my work on cross-border cooperation, interregional cooperation. So between all kind of regions across Europe, all kind of funding programs from the EU, where I both write proposals and help set up cooperations and also manage projects, which I still am doing up to date, you can say. I'm 65 now, so I could retire if I would like to, but I don't like to. I prefer carrying on, especially because I like this type of work. Later years, I've been involved more and more in climate and nature-based solutions kind of projects in all kind of EU programs, but also in other settings. I've written a proposal on nature-based peace, you can say, which I sent to Jeremy, and which I'm happy to share also with others. So Jeremy, feel free, and alongside reporting this this call, to send it along to others in the group, in the team, and also in others who were invited. Basically.
Is that the university, River University proposal?
No, the other one,
No, it's
Blueprint
the other one.
Piece, which I sent.
Blueprint for Print. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm happy to share that and also mention that later on in this call. So that's maybe from my side briefly for now.
Great, thank you, Victor. Now, okay, go to Pearson.
Hi, yeah, battling a bit of a cold right now, so if I sound a bit weird, that's why. But yeah, so originally from Canada, grew up there, did my undergrad at McMaster University in political science, moved to London a little over 3 years ago. I did my master's of conflict studies at the London School of Economics, where I kind of focused on conflict resolution in civil war contexts, specifically looking at sort of the effects that multiple different international organizations have on peace processes. So
can I just ask you, what drew you into doing conflict studies?
Well, initially, I was always kind of interested in history and politics, and I don't know, there's just something about conflict resolution that always drew me in terms of kind of it being rewarding work in terms of improving the lives of people, and also just kind of an interesting and unique challenge in terms of finding solutions in complex situations, or trying to.
Right.
And so, yeah, did that looking at ECOWAS and UN operations in West Africa during the 90s and 2000s. And then after I graduated, I joined RPI. I was working with Michael for a bit, looking at a possibility of doing something in China and Taiwan. And then starting kind of January 2022, I started working with Jeremy on this project, writing and looking at Ukraine and Russia. And then I've also, last year, I was working for a peacebuilding organization here in London, doing work in Turkey and the Middle East generally, but focused on the Kurdish issue there.
And which peacebuilding organization was that one?
It's called Democratic Progress Institute.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I was doing that up until September.
Until September, yeah. Great, thank you, Pearson, very much. And Ruben.
Hi, my name is Ruben. I am from Venezuela. I'm currently living in the UK in Bristol. I studied political science in my undergraduate, and I did my master's in conflict resolution and mediation in Israel. So I'm very interested in conflict resolution as well as you, Pearson. And since I moved to the UK, I've been working with the Jubilee Center as operations manager. I'm just really interested in public policy, and it's fascinating to see how we can use biblical principles to influence policy making across the board, not just in Europe, but also in the US and in South America. And now I'm sort of helping with the website development of RPI and blog making, whatever is needed. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And you've just run a marathon at Lucerne.
Marathon yesterday in Lucerne.
Wow.
40 kilometers. It was beautiful, but I was in pain.
Yeah. Great, congratulations.
Yeah.
So I better say something about myself as well. That I'm a vicar in Kent, but I've done lots of different things over the years, and one of them was being involved in peace building from 1980s, well, 1988 really into 9, working with Michael Schluter on the South Africa question. So actually back into 1986, when the second state of emergency in South Africa was at its worst, and Michael and I were in the same house group in the church, but we were concerned to look at how to engage in that question in a constructive and a well-informed way, which would help to generate peace. And so we developed a document called Alternative Constitutional Settlements in South Africa, which I took out with me in December 86, and took around the place and got 6 people involved, and coming across to Dnieper Park, which was the home of Viscount and Lady Brentford. And after we've given our introductions, I just want to also have a moment's silence, because Jill, Lady Brentford, has just died. She died last night, and so I think we must respect her memory. Crispin Viscount Brentford was the chairman of the conference, Michael Schluter's brother. And so the Dnieper Park Initiative in South Africa ran on from 1986 through to 1991, essentially, having a whole series of consultations at Dnieper Park, the home of Viscount and Lady Brentford, but then when they had to sell it, going to other places as well. But the whole idea was to bring people together who could talk in a safe environment and look at a carefully presented range of issues to them, tailored in such a way to look at different options and how the principles, and we're looking at, in that case, specifically Christian principles, would inform the sort of outcomes which would be promoted. I could also mention that the former executive director of the NPI, who took over from me, but he was at a much higher level, really, Washington Kumu, came back in 1994 and was a key mediator in the bringing about the elections to take place safely and peacefully in that year, because there's a huge danger of the Zulu-based party, the Inkatha Freedom Party, breaking away and creating huge violence. So they were brought on board. Then from 1994 to 1999, we were involved in the Rwanda question, and that involving members of the government there too, looking at issues, for example, of the overcrowding of the prisons after the genocide, how that would be dealt with, the problem of the agricultural economy, how the churches could respond, etc. Lots of different areas. That carried on until 1999, and then from 1999, we were involved in the Sudan question, which was involved the civil war between North and South Sudan, which had caused up to 2 million deaths up to that point. But it wasn't just a North-South issue, it was the many different regions of the country. And so we had another informal process involving people from all the different regions coming together. Our first meeting was actually in South Africa, and then a whole series in the UK, and then one finally in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. So that was we changed the name to Relationships Foundation International, because it wasn't a specifically Christian program then, because of course we were dealing across the faith divides as much as anything with Christian Muslims and animists to a certain extent. So that had a slightly different approach, but we drew then much more on what we called then relational principles. And it's these relational principles which we are also referring back to today, because they were in the family of organizations which Michael Schluter developed, the key idea that you have these relational principles. We'll come to that in the course of the presentation. And then from 2014 onwards, I was started to be drawn into the Ukraine question. And then we were also drawn into the Korea one, and that became the book, No Other Way to Peace in Korea, which is advertised on our website, which Michael and I and a whole team of us worked on and published, as I brought together what we now call the mutual convergent development process, but we'll be talking about in the presentation. And so we couldn't really get to the point of having what we had the in-person processes as we had with Sudan, or further back with Rwanda and South Africa. So at the moment, it's both the Korea program and the Ukraine program are very much concept stage. In fact, and the Ukraine one is much less highly developed than is the Korean one, but it's transferring this whole idea of a mutual convergent development process, which we'll be talking about as the center point of an approach which would build peace across the divides. So that was supposed to be my personal introduction, but it's become much more an introduction into the background of RPI. I've also done history and philosophy and a whole lot of other things, but that's all background. Okay.
Maybe may I add just a few words?
Yes.
Which I missed, and maybe also reflecting a bit briefly on what others already mentioned, what you all already mentioned. Yes. Just a few words. One is that basically you mentioned this River University program.
Yes.
Feel happy to also share that information, because that is definitely also useful, I think, for some perspective. And also one of the points I'll just mention just afterwards. The second is that I'm originally Dutch, from the Netherlands. I've lived there for most of my life, but now since my wife is Latvian, we decided to move to Latvia last couple of 5 years. So I live in Latvia now. The third is maybe also an interesting issue, because Jeremy, you were talking about. Sorry.
You're also involved in the whole Kaliningrad cooperation.
Yeah, that's also one of the things. I worked from the Netherlands. I've been involved in a project, originally a German project, agricultural project in the Kaliningrad region. And then I noticed in Russia, noticed in that region that there are a lot of parallels actually to the Dutch landscape. Some polders were developed when it was still German, that region. Some polders were developed by the Dutch 400 years ago. So I already thought then, why shouldn't we do more? It could be a wonderful reference and pilot landscape if you go back into returning natural habitats or restoring natural habitats. It would be a wonderful referral area. And a wonderful pilot area also.
So what years were you doing the Kaliningrad project then?
Well, the last time I was there was 2017. The first time I was there was 2002.
Okay.
2002. And in between, I've been there at least some 10 times, looking into developing all kind of projects. But all the times I failed in setting up these projects because basically the Dutch partners weren't ready yet to work with Russia. They didn't trust the political situation sufficiently, even the regional governments, even the local governments, to step into the deep and apply for a project, even though there was funding available from the Dutch national government. And the Dutch embassy actually welcomed the ideas of a new project being developed on water, for example, and on nature restoration. But we never managed to get that along. That also brought me in contact, that was actually my last point, of which I wanted to mention, brought me in contact with the coalition Clean Baltic, who set up this river university. And it also triggered what you said, Jeremy. One other issue I've been involved in on a sideline, you can say, which I also mentioned in my document on the river university. When I was working for the Euregio, the cross-border region in Netherlands and Germany, it was also the host of the Secretariat for the Association of European Border Regions, which is now based in Berlin, as far as I know. It was used to be in Gronau in Germany on the Dutch border. And we had a lot of visitors then coming from across Europe, including, for example, Northern Ireland. And I remember the lady there from Northern Ireland who came to us in the early 90s. She said, well, all the citizens, all the entrepreneurs on both sides of the border, they're actually sick of all the troubles. They really want things to change. So that was before the big agreements between Northern Ireland and Ireland, apparently,
Right,
years
right.
before that.
That's an
And they
interesting
said that
example.
they already were initiating cross-border projects and programs and wanted to learn from us how we did that.
Right.
Because they said working together in tourism, for example, and these kind of issues could help making the ground ready for cooperation also in other fields. So perfectly in line with your thoughts, I would say. And one initiative really sticked out to me later on, also in the peace program there. They restored an old canal between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and they said it costs millions to restore all the old locks and canal sides and bridges. But even if only 10 tourist boats per year go through the canal, even if only 1 or 2 tourist boats per year go through the canal, it's worth every cent of investment, because it brings together people. It brings
Right.
it brings literally cross-border contacts. So that
sounds great.
These kind of lines are so important in this issue, I think.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
That's a great lead into our presentation, I think, Vita. Thank you. But before I do that, I just want us to have a moment's silence to, I said we would, Michael Schluter gives his apologies. Of course, his sister, Jill, died. And so let's just have a moment's silence to honor her life and also her contribution to the whole peace building enterprise that we've been involved in. Okay, thank you. Now let's dive in. And so, Chris and I will do sort of double acts on this one. So sort of divided up between us, doing different slides, but we've done them all together in a sense as well. So Pearson, I'm going to hand over to you, and you kick us off with the building bridges presentation, please. And as you go, just mention which slide you're on. That would help us all.
All right. So start off. Right. Oh, I can. With the first slide, the overview of recent events. Kind of make this brief
because they're all numbered at the bottom. Of course, you'll see.
Yeah. So this is
right-hand corner.
Slide 2.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just kind of a brief overview of the events of the past 6-ish months. So the first was the renewed Russian offensive in Kharkiv, which was kind of the first major push that Russia had made into Ukrainian territory from that axis since the opening of the conflict in 2021. This offensive made some slow progress with heavy casualties, but did not make any sort of significant advances in the region to make kind of a serious threat at recapturing of Russia capturing Kharkiv again, and has kind of largely been repulsed with Ukrainian counteroffensives being able to retake many of the towns and villages that were lost. Although, as is kind of the trend of the conflict, a lot of the fighting is very sort of defensive, with high attrition rates and high casualty counts for any sort of gains made. the next kind of big event that happened in the last few months is obviously the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk, which is the first sort of major ground offensive made by Ukrainian troops into Russian territories. Although there was some sort of non-uniform kind of partisan actions in kind of the Belgorod region. This was sort of the first major push done by Ukraine, and it proved to be highly successful, catching Russia very much off guard and capturing kind of large swaths of territory in its opening stages. Since then, it's slowed down quite a bit, and Russian counteroffensive action has captured most of the territory, roughly half of the territory lost.
I could also mention that the role of their going through the same river which flows into the Dnieper.
And
the Ukrainians are blowing the bridges as the pontoon bridges at a point.
But for Ukraine, while the offensive hasn't really caused any major change in sort of the outlook of the conflict, I don't think it did succeed in kind of renewing a lot of the enthusiasm and support for Ukraine, especially amongst the Western allies, and kind of renewed hope that they'll be able to win, for lack of a better term, and defeat Russia. It also allowed Ukraine to hit targets deeper into Russian territories with its sort of the long-range missile systems that they've been kind of given the green light to use. A lot of these strikes by weapon systems like the ATACMS have proved pretty effective against Russia, hitting supply oil depots, airfields, and other kind of establishments and encampments deep in Russian territory, and this has kind of caused some significant disruptions.
And drones, of course, drones. Use of drones,
Russia has also continued its slow advance in the southeast in the Donbass region. Currently, they're pushing towards the city of Pokrovsk. This, like the rest of the fighting, is characterized by very slow, heavy casualties, but they have continued to make sort of consistent progress in the region and continuing to capture territory despite heavy losses. And then the final one, which is not put on the slide but should be mentioned, is that in the past few days you've seen the deployment of North Korean troops to the front lines of the conflict in Kursk. Estimates put it around 1,500 troops being deployed, which is obviously a pretty dangerous expansion of the conflict, as it represents kind of the first direct deployment of regular troops from an outside party since the beginning of the conflict.
So I think the potential 15,000 from those who already now moved into Russia.
Yeah, so large numbers being moved there, and you're starting to see them get deployed to the front lines and engage in the fighting. We can move to the next slide. So this kind of the other world developments that we think are kind of really important and worth mentioning in kind of the interrelated and interconnectedness of global politics and conflict. These are obviously the ongoing conflict in the Middle East between Israel, obviously starting with Gaza, which is now expanded into Lebanon and Iran. When the conflict first arose, there was sort of concerns in Ukraine that weapons and material would be diverted away from them in support of Israel, especially from the US, which has not really proven to be a major concern yet. But as the conflict has expanded in the last few weeks with the major offensive into Lebanon and sort of increasing attacks and operations against Iran directly from Israel, then this sort of question comes back. You also see kind of some tensions arise between Ukraine and the West, with kind of Western willingness to deploy more advanced weapon systems in support of Israel versus Ukraine. So in the past week, you've had Zelensky voicing frustration about the deployment of advanced air defense systems in Israel by the US to counter Iranian drone strikes, but they haven't done anything similar with Ukraine. Obviously, the reason why is that Russia is a nuclear power, and the US is being very cautious to not escalate tensions with them too much, but still a point of sort of frustration.
Although you could also mention, and this is in the last couple of days, the Israelis have been hitting missile and drone factories in Iran.
Yes.
And of course, the Iranian supply of Shahid drones to Ukraine has been quite a major factor in the Russian arsenal.
Yep, that is worth mentioning. The other one is obviously the upcoming US presidential election on next week. The Democrats with Biden have been fairly consistent with their support for Ukraine and their willingness to provide material and kind of increasing the kinds of weapons that they're willing to provide. However, the Republican Party has been much more anti-Ukraine, especially amongst the MAGA camp, the Trump, the Trump hardcore. Supporters in Congress have at various points blocked aid to Ukraine. And so the upcoming election provides a great question mark. Should the Democrats remain in power, it could probably be expected that we'll have more of the same moving forward, perhaps with ever greater support. But Trump, as always, remains a big question mark. Trump has had a long time friendly and vocal support for Putin, and has been at odds with Ukraine in the past, which brought him to being impeached in Congress, as he was asking for information about his political rivals in exchange for military support. But he's also said, as seen on the quote in screen, that he thinks he could solve the conflict very quickly if he regained power. Likely, he would try and strong arm both Zelensky and Putin by telling Zelensky he will cut aid if he doesn't make concessions, and likely by strong arming Putin by saying he will increase aid mostly by large amounts if he's not willing to come to the table. That seems like the likely situation. So he remains, as always, sort of the wild card who could force both sides to come to a negotiating table, or could very much doom Ukraine if he decides to pull his support. So the next slide, discussing the need for peace. The most obvious of these being that the need to sort of end the death and human suffering that has been caused by the conflict. I think all of us here kind of know that at the core, the work we do in cooperation and peace building is with that goal in mind. And the conflict has proven to be incredibly deadly and destructive, and has caused enormous suffering on both sides, Russia and Ukraine. And the other reason for peace is to allow both sides to recover and rebuild, but especially Ukraine, as we look towards long-term peace. It would allow both sides to kind of recover economically and allow average citizens to return to a normal, prosperous life, but it would also allow Ukraine to build up its military and defensive capabilities. One of the big criticisms of any sort of armistice is that this would just allow Russia time to sort of regroup and rearm in exchange for a renewed offensive in the near future. But it could also be argued that it would allow Ukraine to really build up its fortifications, build up its arsenal, become acquainted with the sort of Western weapons that it's started to kind of rely on, especially when it comes to fighter planes and drones and advanced sort of artillery and missile systems. And especially considering the conflict thus far has proven the sort of massive defensive advantage provided by modern weapons. An end to fighting could provide Ukraine time to build up its defenses, which would ward off any sort of future aggression from Russia and discourage it. And so the next slide before I pass over to Jeremy. So we have the sort of challenges and considerations that would go into any sort of peace process. Obviously, you need the political will for peace to be reached successfully. You need the political will to achieve peace despite the various challenges and road bumps that come through any peace process between Russia, Ukraine, and all their allies. Geopolitical tensions will need to be managed not only between Russia and Ukraine, but also between their various allies and supporters. So the West, the US, Europe, Russia, China, BRICS, all these parties that have sort of become involved in some way, shape, or form, even in a minor way, to sort of manage tensions between them. Financial stability will need to be addressed. The conflict has caused large-scale economic damage to both countries, and peace and rebuilding is extremely expensive. So being able to have a steady and reliable source of financial support and stability in order to keep peace as the preferable option for all parties involved will be very important. And finally, the environmental situation in Ukraine is risky, most notably with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is the largest in Europe and has been on the front line or near the front line for the last few years. And sort of concerns about its stability as well as sort of the environmental damage done by the conflict, and the need to preserve things like clean drinking water, which has kind of been put at risk by the events of the conflict thus far.
Right.
Pass it over to Jeremy.
Great, thanks, Pearson. Any questions before we move on to the next section, for which I'm going to lead? Okay, I'll move on. So I think our approach, RPI's approach, is based on relational principles, which were developed especially in the relationships foundation, and these various principles were identified as key to any social need for cohesive social policy. So these boil down to that there are mutual duties and responsibilities, that there's loyalty, and that, in other words, there's parity in all relationships, that there's loyalty and faithfulness, that there's continuity over time, continuity, compassionate, generosity and kindness, that this is part of a vision of society in which all are looked after, and that there's fairness, justice, and truth, and that it's done on the basis of equity, and that there's mutual tolerance and respect. And this mutuality is key to the whole idea, as we're going to set out, of a mutual convergent development process. So any approach which is undergone now onto 7 has to involve 3 things. Firstly, there needs to be trust between the parties, so that you need to find ways of areas of cooperation. Sorry, we need to move on to the next one. You've been number 7, please. Okay, so it needs to have trust. It needs to foster trust and cooperation between the divided regions, as we'll be looking at that in Ukraine. In other words, we need to find areas of cooperation which can be part of that trust building process. There needs to be resilience, that there needs to be a way in which, especially as we'll be looking at water, energy, and ecological questions, so that then this needs a resilient systematic undergirding, and the collaboration, that there's example of good collaboration across these divides, which can be then can have a knock-on effect in what's done in other areas as well. So moving on to the next slide, number 8. So there needs to be monitoring and enforcement, obviously, for long-term sustainability, public participation. In other words, not just by a few technocrats, but it needs to involve the whole public. And also it needs to be adaptable. It needs to change and be able to adapt to the different situations as it unfolds. Okay, so those are the basic sort of requirements for any process which we need to have. Now, moving on to slide 9, what RPI has developed in the case of Korea is this whole idea of mutual convergent development. So in the context of Korea, we were developing the whole idea of an agricultural community, which would then lead on to other forms of cooperation. But whether it's Ukraine or Korea, and we'll be coming to what it might be in Ukraine, it draws on the example of the European coal and steel community in the aftermath of the Second World War, where, of course, the Germans and the allies, including French, Dutch, Belgians, etc., had to find a new way of living with one another. And so they found this idea of the European coal and steel community, which of course eventually became the European community and now the EU. So in other words, where there was peace and where there was conflict previously, especially between Germany and its neighbors, this was now replaced by cooperative and collaborative institutions, so much so that the Germans are now so deeply ingrained in this that any other way of operating is virtually unthinkable. Would you say, Wietse?
Yeah, indeed. I fully agree. Actually, it was also one of the principles which I learned in my early career when I started with Euregio, the cross-border cooperation. The idea why it was formed already in the 1950s was actually also based on the European coal and steel community, saying that how can nation states cooperate with each other when at each border there's still this old conflict idea, this conflict way of thinking, when there's still borders, when they still exist, not only in the on the map, but also in the mindset of the people, or actually are enforced like that by the national governments rather. Whereas from the past, let's say the communities on both sides of the border are quite close, both in language and culture, and it actually needs some change of mindset from our side. So at that point in the 1950s, some local politicians from both sides of the border decided to shake hands, to reach out their hands across the border, literally, and said we should restart and rethink our cooperation, our ancient ties, and restore them, our cultural ties, our religious ties, because both sides of the communities, for example, on the Dutch east side and the German west side, were Catholic, from, let's say, center to south, and were Protestant on both sides of the border from center to north of the Netherlands, if you look on the map. So those communities were very much in contact with each other until basically the end of the war. And restoring that trust and restoring that cooperation was a key to, I think, still is a key as part of the whole EU cooperation. Because if there wasn't this regional cooperation, if there weren't these now mainly economical cooperation programs like Interreg, they originated in this cross-border cultural exchanges, which already originated at the very early days of the European coal and steel community. So if it wasn't for both bottom-up and top-down approach having been done jointly, it wouldn't have been as far as it is now. Is my key.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That's very, very interesting, very helpful. Okay, so moving on to the different phases of the MCD. Now, as when we come to Ukraine, this is how we suggest a mutual convergent development process might unfold. It's only a suggestion. It's simply we're developing the concept and see how it might work. So the first phase, phase one would be joint projects for the lower, and there's a spelling mistake there, Dnieper across the divides. Now, at the moment, of course, in the Kherson Oblast, the Russians are now on the southeast, or the right, also now called the left bank, if you look at the Dnieper going down the river. And then the Ukrainians, of course, now on the right bank. They reoccupied Kherson, including the city of Kherson. So the river then provides the divide between the Russian-occupied and the Ukrainian-held areas. So the first phase then would be finding joint projects across that divide. And then the second one would then be building economic cooperation across the whole 1991 area of Ukraine, without trying to work out at this stage what should happen to the allocation of land, because that would be part of the peace arrangement, but more in terms of just seeing how the building blocks for cooperation could be put into effect, and especially using the relational principles. How can an organization, especially a company, for example, operate on properly relational lines? And this cuts across the sort of very highly liberal individualistic approach of the West and the very highly cooperative command economy of the East. And so that is a third way, which you're suggesting, of more relational approach to building economic cooperation. And then building social cooperation across those divides. We'll come to that further down the road, and find that you try to build, and this Vitsi, you're talking about this, ways in which you can find commonalities across borders and
Right.
those divisions. And then moving then to some sort of confederal structure, a sort of loose arrangement, drawing together the different building blocks before moving towards a multi-connected and neutral federation of oblasts. In other words, that is pushed without having to try and push Ukraine into either of the two armed camps at the moment, between either into NATO or into the Russian CSTO, for example. Rather allowing a much more open textured relationship, allowing Ukraine to build relationships all across those divides. Finland was an example of this. It's no longer, of course. Finland is now firmly part of NATO, but at some point it was seen as the ultimate example of a neutral country, and Sweden too. But both of those are now forced into NATO. But Ukraine could conceivably have such an open-ended status. But anyway, that's further down the road. I'm handing over now to Pearson, and you're going to start telling us how this will work specifically in the context of Ukraine.
Yep. All right. So go to the next slide. So looking at kind of laying the foundations for peace, the first thing that's necessary is sort of the creation of a ceasefire, an armistice of some kind, and a framework for future peace process and a roadmap to move from an armistice, just an end of the fighting, towards a more long-term and stable peace agreement. Obviously, this framework kind of needs to be something that both sides are committed to, so that they are able and willing to work through the challenges that inevitably would come up during that sort of difficult time of moving from war to peace. Part of this foundation will require scientific cooperation between Russia and Ukraine, specifically looking at environmental issues along the Dnipro River. This would constitute the establishment of joint scientific committees made up of environmental scientists, hydrologists, climatologists from both countries, and other members of the international community to provide data and scientifically driven management plans to address issues in the region. There will also be kind of the need for joint cooperation on addressing infrastructure projects in the region. The most significant of these being the reconstruction of the Kakhovka Dam, which we'll discuss in greater detail shortly, as well as water treatment and flood control projects. Also need to address the environmental flaws to protect the delicate and sensitive ecosystem of the river. And all of this needs to be done with safety and sustainability in mind and at its core in order to balance human needs with the environmental impacts of what is done and to protect the sort of fragile environment and ecosystem of the river. So if we go to the next slide.
Yep.
The phase 0 is the reestablishment of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This was brokered at the beginning of the conflict by the UN and Turkey to allow the safe passage of Ukrainian grain through the Black Sea into and through the Dardanelles, to allow sort of the export of Ukrainian grain to Africa and the Middle East, sort of food sensitive or food insecure, countries who often rely on grain from Ukraine in order to have food. This agreement was kind of ended in the summer of 2023 when Russia pulled out. So restarting the agreement or the creation of something similar not only allows for the flow of food back out to these countries, but also creates a venue for Ukraine and Russia to interact outside of conflict and to build, sort of rebuild that relationship outside of rebuild the relationship off the battlefield in some small sort of ways. So next slide. So we've talked about this a little bit, the creation of the Lower Dnieper Water, Energy, and Economic Community. This is based on the model of the European Steel and Coal Community and inspired by RPI's work in Korea. So the goal of a body like this, as we discussed earlier, is to move away from a zero-sum approach to conflict resolution where there's a winner and loser, and to move towards an approach where both sides benefit, and to create a body through which all parties concerned can benefit from the resources and prosperity of the river. Community would be structured, have a structure inspired by the European Steel and Coal Community, including a high authority, an assembly, and would be possibly made up of representatives from Russia and Ukraine, as well as guarantors from the international community, such as Turkey, who, with the Grain Initiative, have proven themselves to be successful brokers between the two countries, as well as other members of NATO, the CTSO, and BRICS. And the goal of the community would be to allow for the mutual benefit of Ukraine and Russia to encourage further development towards peace and to rebuild trust and cooperation through consistent interaction and to disincentivize a return to conflict. So next slide about the rebuilding of the Kakhovka Dam. The dam was destroyed in 2023, causing widespread flooding and destruction downriver. Many people lost their lives, and there's a lot of damage done to the sort of wetlands and fragile ecosystems further downriver. So the reconstruction of the dam in a safe, sustainable, and environmentally conscientious way would be an utmost priority for both Russia and Ukraine, and would allow a sort of non-political venue of cooperation, as rebuilding the dam is very much in the interest of both parties. And would prevent future challenges regarding the dam.
You might mention the need for irrigation, especially not just in the south on the either side of the Kakhovka Dam, but also the Crimean Peninsula, which of course is heavily dependent upon the water from there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which goes through the canal. Yeah. that would be something else that would likely be included in the community, is sort of the reopening of the canal and the flow of water into the Crimea Peninsula from the Dnipro River. So the next slide, another big concern would be the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is the largest in Europe and is currently in Russian-occupied territory. The plant has been damaged several times during the course of the conflict, and also relied on the Kakhovka basin for its water supplies and its reservoir. So thus far, the International Atomic Energy Agency has sort of said that there is no sort of major cause for concerns in terms of water level or the damage done to the plant, but obviously very much concern the risk of kind of nuclear meltdown. It would be on a scale that would dwarf Chernobyl. So definitely a major concern for both Russia and Ukraine, and sort of being able to stabilize the plant and allow for energy to flow out into both Ukraine and Russian held territory would be enormously beneficial for both sides, as they get access to reliable energy from a source that does not provide, is not adding carbon dioxide to the environment. And then the final slide before I pass it back to Jeremy, the ecosystems and caring for them. The ecosystems of the lower Dnipro has been heavily damaged by the ongoing fighting and the destruction of the dam. There will need to be considerable work done to repair these ecosystems and help them recover, which presents another opportunity for cooperation between both sides, as environmental recovery would present an arena for Russia and Ukraine to cooperate and work together without dealing with the major political controversies that could derail a peace process, and would be in the best interest of both countries to have sort of these stable, healthy ecosystems along the river.
Great, thanks.
Dnipro and Spit, was it also damaged by the dam blast?
A little bit, but also just ongoing fighting there.
Fighting there, okay.
You've had Russian troops and Ukrainian troops sort of fighting on the Spit at various points.
Okay.
Especially as Ukraine tries to recapture it to reopen the ports at the base of the river.
Okay, yeah. It's also a very crucial point if you look at the map in perspective of Kherson and the other side of the river. Yeah.
That's right. And it goes out. It's actually technically part of the Nikolaev Oblast.
Yeah.
In fact. Yeah. This sort of goes right underneath.
Also across the river. Yeah. I see.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Pearson. Now I'm going to deal with these next two phases quite briefly. The next three ones really. Okay, so moving on to phase 2. So the idea is that you'd have the next phase would be moving up the river, so that you'd have a joint arrangement across all the way across the Ukraine area, 1991 area. And that would involve cooperation all the way up the river through to Kiev, trying to build a common approach for the whole of the area. But before we can do that, we need to build cooperation so that you have joint funding and investment across that whole area, and using the idea of relational principles for cooperation to find ways to link the two controlled areas with one another. So the economic interest is an important one, which involves joint funding, investment, dispute resolution mechanisms, and capacity building. And then then to the next phase, phase 3, to have social cooperation. So in addition to the economic cooperation, have all the different cross-cutting engagement across the divides, and things like river-based events, tourism development, youth exchange programs, so that it builds the idea that the river is something in common and a point of contact and common enjoyment, and not just as a point of division. And then moving on to, so that goes to, Ruben, I've rushed on. So economic cooperation, building blocks for economic cooperation, then we go to social cooperation, and then the river-based events, etc. So that's in phase 3. And moving on to phase 4, confederal structure, expanding the course of the whole river to some idea of a commission to look after that whole area, the running of that whole area, all the way down from the border with Belarus through to the Dnieper, and so including the upper Dnieper or Dnipro, the cross-border river basins, and then the joint care of the environment all the way up that riverine basin. And then moving on to phase 5, having the neutral multi-connected federation of oblasts, so that the river carries on through Belarus and then into Poland. And so that would also then encourage cooperation with those two countries as well. And of course, with all the surrounding countries in addition, with Lithuania, Latvia, and Romania as well as Slovakia and Hungary. So there'd be a real, although none of those other later ones are part of the Dnieper complex, the principle of trying to build cooperation across the borders would have a knock-on effect into that wider cooperation, as Belarus and Poland are drawn into a Dnieper Basin Commission. So you have the member states, the institutional framework, and international cooperation drawing in on international expertise. So that's really where we are with that idea.